Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Sheena Chestnut Greitens, the editor-in-chief of TNSR, and today I'm joined by the chair of our editorial board, Dr. Frank Gavin. We're pleased to have joining us today Shivshankar Menon, chair of the Ashoka Center for China Studies in New Delhi, and a former national security advisor to the Indian Prime Minister. He's joining us today to talk about his TNSR article, A New World Order, Be Careful What You Wish For, which can be found in Volume 9, Issue 1 of the Texas National Security Review. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to be here, and especially with you, Shankar, someone who I consider a great friend and who I've admired for quite a long time. And I do want to get into this fascinating article, but I wonder, you've had such a fascinating career in diplomacy and statecraft. I wonder if you could share with our listeners a little bit about some of that extraordinary history and how you became a diplomat and how you became interested in these questions and what were some of your more interesting posts and experiences.
Well, I wandered into diplomacy, actually. It wasn't my first choice. I thought I was going to do a PhD on ancient India and ancient China. But, the late 60s, early 70s, I wanted to see China, because to study China without seeing China seemed wrong. And there were only two ways of doing that. One was to become a Maoist guerrilla and go underground. And the other was to become an Indian diplomat. So I chose the easy way. I did the exam, got in, I was lucky, and they sent me to China. And the first job they gave me was analyzing Chinese internal politics towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. I went in 74 to Beijing. And this is when Mao died, Zhou died, the Gang of Four, Deng came, went, Deng came back. I mean, it was such a rich diet that I got hooked. And I was lucky. I was sent back to China 3 times on posting, dealt with China, so I could indulge my interest, my passion. And I can't say I regretted a moment of it. I was also lucky because I, worked around China as well in Japan, and then did several years of atomic energy, 4 years in Vienna in the mission to the IEA, and then in the commission at home. I can only say I was lucky to have a job which I enjoyed, which got me out and about, traveling, seeing the world, meeting interesting people. That's the advantage of being a diplomat. You tend to work with interesting and intelligent people most of the time. I was posted as ambassador in Israel, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan. And each one was different, and each one was a challenge, but it was fun. So that's it. That's really all I can tell you about myself. But I count myself truly lucky.
It's an extraordinary background. And while I do want to get into the article, you told me recently about a book you're working on and your family's engagement with China. Maybe you could briefly tell us about this, because I found it utterly fascinating.
Well, my grandfather was sent to China in 1943 during the war as what they call the agent general of the government of India to China, because India wasn't independent, couldn't have an ambassador, and they had to find a title, and they thought Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek would welcome another general. So they sent him. And between 1943 and 2014, I think there were only 4 years when one of us, my grandfather, my father, my father-in-law, my uncle, me, wasn't either in China or dealing with China. So I thought I'd try and write a sort of family biography, or the family in China, and try and put it together. But I'm still getting my head around how to do this.
I can't wait to read it. It's going to be an amazing read.
Well, I can't wait to write it, but I have to figure out how to do it.
Well, hopefully we can publish excerpts of it, because everything you do, it's always fascinating. How did you come to decide to write a piece on world order, or to think about world order? I mean, this is clearly a topic. So many people are writing about it. You have such an interesting, much different take than other people, which I want to get to. But what sort of inspired just the idea of diving into the topic?
I think it's this increasing sort of sense of uncertainty. People seem, and this has been going on since 2008, and an increasing nostalgia for a sort of vanished golden age, as if there was some time when everything was wonderful, when things were easy, when life was predictable. And somehow that didn't seem right to me. Both seemed a bit dangerous to me because thinking about it, I realized that we'd constructed this mythology of world orders, which were really an exception in historical terms when you think across time, across broader stretches of time. And the nostalgia especially seemed dangerous to me because it seemed to me that it would lead people to do things which wouldn't fit with the times. And therefore, you were essentially fighting against the grain of history, and you would end up doing foolish things. So that's really what led me to start thinking about it. And then, of course, what about India's place in this? Because for India, it's been very important as we try and transform India into a modern, more prosperous country. What kind of world are we operating in? We can't do that alone. The world really matters to us and matters increasingly as we get increasingly integrated. So that's what really brought me to think about this problem.
There are two really important points. I wonder how they relate, how they're separate. One is this nostalgia that we feel for a past that actually wasn't accurate, right? And you make it very clear in the article that this so-called golden age was not golden for everybody. In fact, for most of the world's population, it generated problems. And that even for those who thought they benefited from, they have a tendency to forget. So I'm interested, is that just something that human beings are inclined to do? And the other really powerful point is about world orders are the exception, not the rule. They're anomalous. And as you show really brilliantly in the article, when it does emerge, it's because of a particular set of circumstances. Both of these excellent points really cut against, I think, what's fair to say, the prevailing arguments that we hear, particularly in places like London or Washington. How are those arguments related, and why do you think people engage in both this nostalgia and in this false nostalgia and this sort of notion that world order is kind of a normal fact of life that should be aspired to?
Well, I think it's a reassuring thought, right? And certainly those who exercise power in the order would spread the idea that the order is essential, that you need stability, that you need the peace. And the fact is that if you look at the period since World War II, we did experience a tremendous improvement in human welfare, economically, and in various ways in terms of what science, medicine did for people's longevity. People lived longer, healthier, more prosperous, better lives than ever before, more people on Earth than ever before. And now, do you ascribe that to a world order or not? And that's really the question. And that, frankly, I don't have an answer to that. But the fact is that when people look back at the period since World War II, many people talk of the long peace. But for those of us in maritime Asia, frankly, these were not very peaceful years. They were peaceful in Europe. They were peaceful, across the Atlantic for the US, for Europe. But in the killing fields of Asia, as Chamberlain calls them, 1,200 people died every day during the Cold War, every day for 45 years. And that's something. And I think this leads to this problem that we face today. There are large sections of humanity, many countries in the world, who are unsatisfied with the way the world runs, who feel unsatisfied enough to want to join something like over 40 countries want to join BRICS, for instance, an organization which has produced no known outcomes economically, politically, but why do they want to join it then? I think it's just this unease with the way the world is run and the way the world works. Whereas there's another huge section of the world which thinks that, look, the world was run perfectly and worked very well. And we need to go back to that. And that's where the nostalgia comes in. And where, therefore, you have people pulling in opposite directions.
I would love to get to a deeper set of questions about how India views this and what you think India's role is likely to be or should be in this current moment of disorder, as you characterize it in the article. But I wanted to ask you, given your deep experience in and with Chinese politics, to ask you about what you're observing with respect to China's engagement with global order right now, because I've been really struck in the past 6 months. If you look at the military parade that was held in Beijing last fall, to some other parts of Chinese rhetoric about world politics, China is both positioning itself as a defender of the post 1945 order in some respects, and clearly deeply dissatisfied with that order in others. And so you think about something like the Global Security Initiative, which China says it has gotten sort of positive statements of support or appreciation from over 100 countries, despite not really knowing what they're signing up for in supporting that initiative. But I think that speaks to a similar phenomenon as you were talking about with BRICS, this dissatisfaction or unease with the current order. But then you see great powers like China that are positioning themselves almost simultaneously as a defender of certain parts of the world order and pushing for revision or change in others. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on how we explain or how we should understand that tension, given how much you know about Beijing and about the way it makes policy.
That's a fascinating question because I think the Chinese, yes, present themselves as defenders of the post-World War II order. And in fact, almost as the last defenders of it, that everybody else seems to have abandoned it. But they seem to have their own definition of what that order was. And that's slightly different from everyone else's experience of it or everyone else's definition of it. So I think that's one set of fascinating questions. But quite apart from that, I think for a practitioner like me, the question is, yeah, what are they going to do about it? Do they want an alternate order of their own, which they run? Are they the new British Empire, the new USA, or are they reverting to tradition? Now, I trained as a historian. I tend to think in those terms. And if they're reverting to tradition, and the tradition that they've invented for themselves, actually, they're more likely to seek adjustments in the present order and to create situations where there's sort of anticipatory compliance with China's interests and wishes, rather than taking on the responsibilities of running a new world order on their own. I mean, if you think of the US after World War II, the US paid huge prices to establish and manage that order, was willing to open her markets to the rest of the world, was willing to actually run a financial system which also benefited others, worked very closely with developing countries for decolonization, for the dismantling of the old European colonial empires. The US actually has paid prices for the order that she ran after World War II. And I'm not sure that China so far has shown the willingness to. When you look at the Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, and so on, to the outsider, it looks like, well, motherhood and apple pie. There's a lot of abstract nouns there, all of which sound good, but what it actually means in practice, you really have no way of telling, except by looking at China's actual behavior of doing what the Chinese say, which is to look at their actions rather than while listening to their words. Judging by that, I think it still has to be proved whether China is willing to assume the responsibilities, the costs, and the burdens of actually running an order or building an alternate order. What she's done is, where existing institutions have not worked in her favor, she's built new institutions, but otherwise, she's tried to modify the behavior of other actors in the international system to suit herself. I think we saw a good example of that in China-Canada relations over the last few years, where they've got the Canadians to lower tariffs on Chinese EVs, and in return, they make certain goods. But they created a situation, frankly, they may not have created it entirely, they were helped, but they got a situation which they then used. And I think that's where I think we should expect Chinese activism, rather than in the attempt to reproduce previous the last two world orders.
I was very struck by your point about tradition and how historians go back to tradition. And you very, very effectively talk about how India and China and others have thought about engaging with the world through tradition and how the notion of world order building, and this very much plays off Sheena's excellent question. Could you tell our audience a little bit about how you think about the tradition both in India and in China and thinking about engaging the world and how it's different or contrasts with this sort of world order mania that we hear about all the time in places like Washington?
Well, it's interesting. If you go back in history, all the way back to Kautilya, say, to Chanakya, who now has become, important to Indian strategic thinking. He thinks of the world as having all kinds of states. I mean, kingdoms, tribal confederations, city states, you name it. And for him, the world it's multipolar. And his whole book is about how do you make alliances in that situation? How do you measure a state's strength? How do you work with others in an international situation? Whereas if you look at the Chinese tradition, and not just Han Feizi, but most of it, it's essentially a unitary view of the world. I mean, there's heaven, there's the son of heaven, and there's earth. And frankly, the only limits on the Son of Heaven are the limits of the extent of his power. But wherever civilization reaches, and civilization is defined as Chinese, as Wanhua, as Chinese literacy, then frankly, it's a single universe. So the temptation to a world order is actually stronger in the Chinese tradition. But that idea of universal kingship, which was fairly common in the ancient world across the board, I think was then modified obviously by their experience and especially by the Western impact. So if you look at Indian and Chinese thinking today, it's not what it was. But the roots are still there, and the predisposition to go back to those roots, or at least to invent those roots and to claim tradition as authority, is still strong. Don't forget that nationalisms in both countries have used history and constructed history and the imagined past to achieve their purposes. And in fact, it's one of the gifts the West gave us in some ways. But today it works in to affect how we look at world order. For India, we've always had a considerable debate within India about what sort of world works for us. Now, given our own plural, diverse nature, we tend to look for a similar world outside. Think it'll be better if the world is democratically run. I tend to see that, at least for China, and the US also constructed essentially a democratic ideal of a world order, a plural one, as President Kennedy said. But for China, I'm not so sure that that's the way they see world order. They see it much more in a hierarchical order sense rather than as how the world is run. Frank, you make a very useful distinction between the international system and world order. And I think that's something we need to remember, because how people react to the international system is tactical. They look at their interests, they see where they can further their interests. But world order is an actual ordering of the world, of trying to run everyone's affairs and telling everyone how to run their affairs. And it needs a certain legitimacy. It also needs a certain basis in power. And I'm not sure that today's world, the distribution of power supports a world order anymore. If you go back to the Cold War, the 50s, between them, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the Soviet Union and the US basically, had over 80% of the world's economic and military power. Today, I don't think the alliances count for what they did. Anyway, Warsaw Pact is gone. NATO, if you judge by what happened in Davos, let's see where it's going. But today, China and the US together account for less than 50% of world GDP and about the same proportion of world military power. That's not a stable basis for a world order. A world order requires a huge imbalance in power. and a preponderance, the sort of thing that the US enjoyed after World War II, or the British Empire had, or the Mongols in the 13th century.
I think what's so interesting about that in your article is that it's this balance between a nation, an empire, a civilization's history and inclinations, which vary, and then these material power aspects. And your essay beautifully balances them both. And I wonder how you think about that mix, right? Because right off the bat, you've explained how India, China, the United States, in your piece, you make it very clear, Great Britain had different traditions and histories and thoughts and inclinations and temperaments towards the world. And that's one variable. And the other variable is, of course, how much power you have to affect things. And there's a kind of a second question related to that, because as I was reflecting on your thoughts about China and the United States, it occurred to me that the United States has always had a kind of actual ambivalence towards order building, that how it feels today, that we may look at the way the United States behaved, let's say, from the late 40s with some interruptions, right? In the 1970s, and then at the end of the Cold War, there were certainly debates that the United States may not be as enthusiastic about order building as we think, and may actually have a view somewhere in its history more similar to India's. So I guess those are the two questions: how the inclination and your wonderful point about tradition relates to material capabilities in terms of what shapes those things, and whether or not, when I read your essay, if you agree, that it actually helped me rethink how the United States has thought about this question of ordering.
Actually, it's interesting that you mention US ambivalence. Some of the US's attractiveness, soft power, actually comes from that very ambivalence. Which bits of US culture spread the fastest? Coca-Cola, blue jeans, and rock and roll, right? These are all the things your mother told you to stay away from. They're all symbols of rebellion. And the US offered, as an ideal, democracy, freedom, and rebellion at the same time. So that ambivalence that you talk about is actually a strength and is attractive to people who don't want to be part of some rigid order established by somebody else in their sole interest. So it's an interesting question that you raise, because it seems to me that today we're in a situation where the US is no longer offering an idea of an order. And I think the world is a much more complicated place, with China rising, with India much more powerful than she's ever been in history, with other countries asserting their own agency. You've heard Canada speaking of the role of middle powers. So the international situation, I think, has evolved to a point where maybe, maybe this is wise of the US not to speak of an order at this stage, because I don't see an order emerging out of the international situation as we have it today. The question is, can we think of an order in the future? Is there an order coming later? I don't know. I find it hard to see that at a time when all the great powers are revisionist in one way or the other. Whether it's the US, I mean, Make America Great Again, the again itself suggests a form of revisionism, or Build Back Better was the same. It's the same when Xi Jinping speaks of China's great rejuvenation. I mean, this is a mythical past. And this idea actually seems to be common across the board, whether it's India, whether it's Russia, wherever you look. So I'm not sure, as I said, neither the distribution of power nor the ideologies that people are today at least adopting suggest an early return to another world order. This, for me as an Indian, is unfortunate, because as a result of the globalization decades, and certainly the opening up that we did since 1991 onwards, today more than half of India's GDP is the external sector. We need the world, whether it's, for capital, for technology, for you name it, for access to markets, for commodities in terms of non-ferrous metals, etc., in order to transform India. And we're not the only ones. I mean, China too. If you think of it, 25% of what China eats is imported. She imports 6 times the IPs that she exports. She depends on the world for energy, for commodities, access to markets, because exports still matter considerably. I mean, with a surplus of $1.2 trillion last year. So you now have a situation which is very different from anything that we've ever known before, where we are inextricably bound to each other in a globalized economy, but we're running local politics. And politics has sort of fragmented us into. So the politics is pulling us in the opposite direction from the globalized economy. And the rules of that economy are being renegotiated as we speak. We no longer run an international trading system based on MFN, which was the basis of much of what we were doing for decades. Therefore, for me, this is a time of change but it's also therefore a time of hope, because this is a time when you can actually make a difference, where ideas make a difference, and where I think people like you, Frank, and you, Sheena, can actually change policy and direct and give people ideas of what they can do and handle things better.
Let me ask you about a discussion that has become more prominent, especially in Washington, D.C., and in U.S. circles, but to some extent in the global conversation in the aftermath of the American strike in Venezuela. And that's this discussion of whether or not we are moving toward a pattern in world politics that's characterized by spheres of influence again. There was this discussion of the Dunroe Doctrine, which I understand has now appeared in some formal U.S. diplomatic documents. There is, this discussion of whether or not we are experiencing a resurgence of great power politics such that the world will sort of be best understood through this old paradigm of spheres of influence. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, if you think that is an accurate or a helpful way of understanding what we're seeing in the current global environment. But then, second, where does that leave a country like India?
I'm not sure that in a globalized economy permits clear spheres of influence. Because that's essentially a political divvying up of the world. And I'm not sure that A, globalized economy, B, today's technologies. When you look at military technologies, they recognize no such boundaries, whether it's missiles, whether it's, nuclear weapons. So for me, it's unlikely that, history repeats itself or that you have perfect analogies. People speak of the period before World War One. These are not perfect analogies for where we are today. I mean, the world has changed. So I'm a bit hesitant of putting those kinds of labels. I'm nervous of calling it a multipolar world too, for the same reason. It's not a Cold War world. It's not, there are many things I can say it's not. How do I describe it? That's the problem. I mean, I call it a world adrift. Otherwise, I used to say a world between orders, but since I'm no longer sure there's another order coming, so I would call it a world adrift. But that doesn't really frighten me too much. Where does it leave India? My mantra is issue-based coalitions of the willing and able. That depending on the issue, you'll get a different set of actors who have an interest and who are capable of doing something about it. Whether it's, you look at maritime security, for instance, it's one set of actors in the Indo-Pacific who work together. There's a Quad, there's India, the US, Japan, Australia. But when it comes to cybersecurity, you have a whole different set of actors. When it comes to energy security, you'd look at a different set of actors. So none of these things are permanent. None of their boundaries are clear. States can be on different sides and different issues. So you have this kind of variable geometry today, which operates. For India, it means hard work, but it also means lifetime employment for diplomats.
Shankar, I love the phrase world adrift, but it brings up two images. One, when I think of the more optimistic side, I think of being adrift in a pool, laying maybe with a nice adult beverage, no thought in the world, just relaxing. But then if I move that from that nice pool where things are contained and I move to an ocean where I don't know where I am, that I'm adrift and I'm at loose ends, and I'm in a world of fear and uncertainty. Being adrift perhaps is not so good. And I was thinking of the challenge with adrift. You very brilliantly talked about the power of globalization, which generates many of the good parts of feeling adrift, the sort of material plenty, the greatly improved outcomes, but also this sense of turbulence and fear and uncertainty, and how globalization, in your view, fits into that ordering instinct. Can you continue to have the benefits of globalization that, as you correctly point out, have generated some extraordinary outcomes, but have also left us feeling unnerved, unmoored, unattached, and may have brought about some of the recidivist, nationalist issues that you point out? How do you think about these powerful forces of globalization? And again, how perhaps in the past this was thought of, what's different this time, and how, in your mind, those two phenomena work together?
Yeah, that's very hard to say because it seems to me that even the sort of populism, nativism, whatever, the isolationist sentiment that we see politically, and the politics of emotion, for instance, that we see in so many of our countries, I think that itself is a result of globalization. And certainly in societies like mine, it's the urbanization, the removal of people from, traditional clan, family, village, and the visibility that globalization has brought, or IT has brought, to everybody. They can see what's happening around them in the world, create aspirations. And that has led to actually the use of hyper nationalist politics in some of our countries. So, in some ways, these are very linked. I mean, globalization has had both effects. It's had these economic benefits and material benefits, but it's also created the politics which are actually threatening those benefits. So I can't predict where it'll go, frankly, and I don't think anybody knows. But I do see the material benefits of globalization limiting what states have done. And this is why I think it's a very different situation from just pre World War I or other periods. Why does China want you to believe that she respects, or at least projects the idea that she was respecting sanctions on Russia? Because she has much bigger stakes in the Western economy. And why, for instance, does India compensate for her absence from all the large economic groupings? We're not part of RCEP, we have or CPTPP or any of the others. We're about to sign a broad-based trade and investment agreement with the EU tomorrow. The EU is chief guest at our Republic Day today. So I think this tension between nationalist politics, almost nativist politics, and this looking inwards, protectionism, and understanding that our interest lies in integrating economically and working with the rest of the world. This is true of India, it's true of the US, it's true of China, it's true of every country. And I don't see how we're going to work our way out of this very easily, because giving up the economics of it would affect the political future of those who do so, and vice versa. We are at a moment, actually. But this is also an opportunity. When I look at South Asia, for instance, we have a polycrisis in South Asia where 4 of the 7 countries in the South Asian Regional Cooperation are talking to the IMF or have adjustment programs already. But this is also an opportunity for us to actually integrate our economies and work together and to open up. And we're willing to do things in crisis which we can't do normally in normal times, which we find difficult politically in normal times. So for me, it's a glass half full. And where it'll end, I don't know. That's an unsatisfactory answer, I realize. I'd like to ask you where you think it's going.
I think it was a brilliant answer, and it leads to sort of a follow-up, which is, as I think about you laying out the benefits and challenges of globalization with the benefits and challenges of order, I think maybe one of the ways to think about it, and this was clearly something that's in the tradition and histories that you mentioned in India, of how to best balance and capture the obvious benefits that come from global engagement while recognizing their costs, some of which are collective and we have to work together. And it got me thinking about how we obsess over the security order, but there's many, many different parts of this order, right? There's many different parts, whether it's, you think of India being a pharmaceutical power, right? And how unbelievably essential that is to global well-being, or becoming an IT power, and how in a world of science and knowledge and this globalization has been a multiplier. And the last thing you would want to do is to impede that. And you probably do need some rules. On the other hand, you don't want something that is this overarching, compelled notion of your political system has to be like this, or you have to choose this person as an ally and an enemy. And that's what's so, I think, compelling about the vision you lay out in the piece, how you balance and get those benefits in a time where people do feel great uncertainty. And so, is there a way, in your view, of separating out some of those things that you mentioned, the sort of positive things, at a time where there's increased security concerns? Or are they always going to be bundled together? I mean, India has to think about this all the time in its relations with the country you know best, China, where there's deep security competition, deep history, but also incredible benefits to engagement. How should ordering think about that?
Well, historically, they've always gone together. Times of great political uncertainty and instability, along with great intellectual, technological, scientific advance. If you go all the way back to the Axial Age, to the 6th, 5th century BC, go back to Abbasid, look, Sung China, when China was divided and weak, and, still you had paper money, the compass, gunpowder. I mean, it's right through history. You think of pre-modern Europe. I mean, that's 400 years of war and the Industrial Revolution at the same time. So I don't think you can ever reconcile the two. But my only point is, don't be frightened of this. Just use the opportunity and be willing to accept that, yes, today we're in a time of disorder, and let's deal with this, and let's make the best of this, and let's produce good outcomes out of it. That in the past, periods of disorder have actually led to progress, and to considerable progress, to accelerated progress. Maybe not in some linear sense, but certainly to jumps in human welfare. That would be my attitude. I don't think there's a resolution to this.
So I love that point about your article, this sort of coexistence of, political churn and technological innovation progress that comes from disrupting old paradigms across the board. I guess I wanted to ask you then, where is the room for opportunity here? See, your article mentions that this is a moment where people thinking about what's possible can potentially have a bigger impact than potentially at other more ordered or more structured moments in human history. So I was curious where you see the biggest potential. It's really easy to look at the world today and be, as an individual or from the perspective of any given country, very anxious about the costs and the risks of the instability. And we see that in rhetoric from China's comments about, sort of the risks and tensions in the international environment increasing, to a lot of the political discourse in the United States and in Europe. So I wanted to ask you, maybe I'm just looking for a silver lining here, but it sounds like you also see potential for progress. On the political side, how do you find that? How do you look for that? How do you understand the and identify the opportunity?
But politically, I think, I'm not sure that the political opportunities really are at home. In India, for instance, for people to see how linked we are to the world today. You look at Indian history, frankly, it's the bits of India which were most connected with the world and the periods when India was most engaged with the rest of the world, trading both East and West, that India was most prosperous and did best. And, you know, the chaos actually leads people to see this, to see that in some ways. And politically, I think the real pressure that this exerts on political leaders to deliver progress at home, to improve the welfare of their own people, is actually not bad as a spur to the right kind of action. If you look at it globally, though, you're undergoing an energy revolution. You have today, thanks to, well, medicine, to biology, you have huge advances in human health. And these are spreading, even though there might be commercial and other interests in keeping it limited. But in today's world, frankly, these things can't be kept limited or controlled anymore. You've seen what DeepSeek did and had to go open source, right? But why did they go open source? Not out of love for the world, because they were in competition, because of partly the chaos led them to do the right thing from the world's point of view. So I see that kind of opportunity rather than an immediate political opportunity to impose order and stability. I'm not sure that we'll get very much stability. That doesn't mean that I think that war is imminent tomorrow. This is not a Hobbesian world. As Frank reminded me, I could still get onto a plane in Delhi, come here to the US, and, everything worked, whether it was immigration, whether it was all the engineering that went into the plane, everything worked. There's still fundamental rules of the road which I think exist, and there is an order of sorts. So it's not complete chaos or anarchy. It's not a Hobbesian world. Besides, the great powers have selfish interest in respecting some rules of the road, whether it's freedom of navigation on the high seas, even the South China Sea, which is highly disputed. Basically, there's still freedom of navigation there because it's in everybody's interest so far. The trouble will be when somebody decides it isn't, but that hasn't happened yet. So I think when we say world order, I think that's a different order of problems. That's a different issue from the kinds of opportunities that we have at various other levels.
This is fascinating, Shankar. I could talk to you forever about these things. I was thinking that one of the reasons I love talking to you so much is I don't know if we would necessarily describe ourselves as optimists, but we're not pessimists. Our good friend Jim Steinberg, I think, thinks, who has a more darker view of the world and recent events, certainly accuses me of that. And I think it's more a healthy historical sense that we've seen many of these things before and
Yeah.
that different cultures and civilizations have grappled with far greater things. One thing I do find both hope and worry about, and I know you think about this a lot because you teach and you're a mentor to young people, and there is this sense of both excitement and anxiety. And I wonder both how you see the younger generations when they're in your classroom, or maybe people starting out in their diplomatic careers in India and around the world, and what message you would give to them, or what message you do give to them.
Well, they're a very different generation from ours. My generation came to, well, awareness in the 60s. And that wasn't a very settled or orderly time at all. But we were highly political and saw the world in political terms, I think. Today, I think the students I teach, certainly the undergraduates and some of the others as well, are much more skilled, much more aware of the world, and they're much more knowledgeable. They've had to compete to get where they are. I mean, to an extent that none of us ever had to. No previous generations, I think, had to. But the result is, I think, my job is to actually get them to realize that, life is unpredictable. You can't just, build a CV and plan the rest of your life. As John Lennon said, life is what happens to you while you're making plans, right? So, and to get them somehow to expand that, and to accept the idea of luck as well. I find that's the one thing that I would tell them. That, and accept luck. I mean, if it's luck, try your luck. Why not? Maybe you're lucky, but accept the fact that sometimes you are going to fail. I think the trouble is we've created such a competitive environment for the next generation that failure is no longer an option for them. Whether it's getting into college, whether it's, in fact, all the way from kindergarten onwards. So the other thing is, of course, that as a practitioner, I find that theory is so seductive that I often have to bring them back to reality and to tell them that theory is useful to teach you how to think about reality, but it isn't everything. Because this is a generation which is highly intelligent and, as I said, has skills and awareness that no previous generation has had. And therefore the seductiveness, special seductiveness of theory. But that's a practitioner speaking.
I think it's a very wise practitioner, a very wise, thoughtful person speaking. And again, just an extraordinary piece. All of our listeners should read Shankar's A New World Order, Careful What You Wish For. It's just absolutely terrific. And I'm still thinking about it, having read it 3 or 4 times already.
Likewise, it was a pleasure to edit and to work on, and we're delighted to have it appear in the Texas National Security Review. It really is a thought-provoking piece for the moment we're living in.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us on Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. Our guest today has been Shivshankar Menon, author of the article A New World Order, Careful What You Wish For, which as always can be accessed for free on our website, tnsr.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, and you can always find more of our work at tnsr.org. Today's episode was produced by TNSR Digital and Technical Manager Jordan Morning and made possible by the University of Texas System. This is Sheena Chestnut Greitens and Frank Gavin. Thanks for listening.